Still the question. An original poem by Jeffery C. White. Can you hear them? Can you hear the jangle of the shackles? Can you hear the cries of my people? Hear them hum? Hum the hymns of God's grace, power, and mercy to get them through. Do you see the beads of sweat glistening on his dark chocolate skin as he stands in a blazing inferno, picking that white soft fluff? But wait! Do you see him? He is running for his freedom. Run, boy! Run! Can you hear that? The crackle of the whip as it cuts through the veins on his hard-earned black skin. Red droplets of anguish begin to ornament the light brown dirt, then flow down his spine like Niagara Falls on crooked mountains. Can you feel it? Can you? Can you feel the earth shake and rumble beneath your feet as if a tidal knot earthquake has shaken this earth, ending all oppression, bending history into concession? Can you hear them singing the songs of liberation? We shall overcome. We shall overcome? But we can't hold their lives anymore. Their souls are detained in an inhabited incubator, some of which were determined by hooded men disguised as justices, adjudicators. A man forcibly stretched out on the ground, screaming, "I can't breathe." Can you hear them again, chanting, demanding, and affirming that Black lives matter too? As they mattered when my ancestors were beaten and scorned? As they mattered when my brethren were hanged from trees, shot while marching, fighting for our glory? And as they mattered when my sisters pleaded to live and stay another day outside of that cold gray barred cloak? And as they mattered before a navy blue uniform became justified ammunition for the annihilation of stained pigmentation? As you listen to this poem, picture these pictures painted in demonic paintbrushes. A land so far gone for what God created to do and be, but there is a question that still remains. It lingers in the whispers of the wind. I hear it at night, calling and asking me to ask you, what will you do to change it? What's up, what's up, what's up, what's up? It is your boy, it is your cousin, it is your best friend here, Jeff, and welcome back to the Visionary Vault, a Black intellectual podcast where we unearth the buried, reclaim the erased, and speak truth to the structures that would rather we forget. Once again, I am Jeff, your co-host and curator of the United States side of things. And Christian will be joining us in a second half of this episode to take us through the Canadian parallels, like always. But first, we want to talk about something foundational, not only to Black life in America, but how Black existence has been perceived, documented, distorted, and controlled. So today, we're cracking open a vault labeled "Who Gets to Tell Black Stories?" and why that control still matters. So let's begin where we must, at the origin, the birth of this nation of the United States, that is, and the birth of a lie. So to understand how Black narratives have been controlled, we have to begin not just at enslavement, but at the ideological architecture that made slavery justifiable. So from the moment my ancestors, Africans, were forcibly brought to the shores of what would become the United States, their humanity was not merely stripped, it was reauthored, right? So let's start with the 1684 Virginia slave codes, which established that all servants imported and brought into the country who are not Christians in their native country shall be accounted and be slaves. So this codified blackness is not just non-Christian, but non-human. So enslaved Africans were written into law not as a person, but as property, as we know. That wasn't accidental. That was narrative manipulation sanctioned by the state. So by 1807, when the transatlantic slave trade was technically abolished by the United States, the narrative control simply evolved. What shifted wasn't the exploitation, but the justification. So the ideology of paternalism took root. So Black people were now cast as childlike, in need of white guidance. The plantation became the stage for this performance. So in literature and political speeches and sermons, white America told the story for us, always with themselves as the moral center, right? Saidiya Hartman, in her seminal works, Scenes of Subjugation, she writes, narrative restraint, coerced confession, and spectacular suffering were all part of the economy of slavery. So let's break that down. Narrative restraint means Black people were not allowed to tell their own truths, not without violent consequences, that is. The coerced confessions wasn't just physical, it was ideological. You had to perform gratitude, loyalty, right? Subservience, or risk punishment. And this sentiment of spectacular suffering refers to how Black pain was displayed as entertainment, lynchings at the core of that, right? As a deterrent, as proof of white dominance. This was not random. It was systemic. The slave narratives project of the 1930s, while often seen as a progressive documentation effort, was still shaped by white interviewers, white editors, and white frameworks. Even our memories were filtered through a white lens, right? So Jefferson famously wrote, right? Thomas Jefferson's note on the state of Virginia, 1785. He wrote, the Blacks are inferior to the whites in the endowment both of body and mind. This wasn't just a racist opinion. It became ideological fuel for centuries of exclusion. So Jefferson helped draft the narratives of intellectual inferiority that would echo across policies, textbooks to this day, media portrayals of us as Black folk, and even early American imaginations. So this is the origin story. Black people were narrated by those who enslaved, feared, or sought to exploit them, exploit us. The implications? When you're not the author of your own story, your very being becomes suspect. This is more than representation. It's about power, about the ability to define what is real.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It is your co-host, Christian Mbanza, coming from Treaty 4, Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. And as Jeff mentioned, I want to start by asking a simple question. What Black stories do you know, and who told them to you? And I mean from a Canadian perspective. If you grew up learning about Black history, chances are it began with American figures. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and I love him just as much as everybody else. But here in Canada, those names might be familiar, but mostly as symbols of struggle that happened somewhere else, somewhere distant, somewhere separate, removed. But Black history in Canada is real. It's rich, and it's been happening for centuries. And these are names I've mentioned before, from Viola Desmond to the vibrant community of Africville, to the Black porters who fought for dignity on Canada's railway. These stories are here. But most Canadians don't know them, not because they don't matter, but because for decades, Black Canadian history has been deliberately erased. And our stories have been left out of textbooks, ignored by mainstream media, and wiped out from public memory. Sometimes that erasure is silence. And I love the stamps that they hand out during Black History Month, but a passing reference is what I'm talking about. And that's not the same as telling the truth. Here's the heart of it. When Black stories are erased or silenced, the question of who gets to tell the story becomes urgent. Because the stories we tell shape how we see ourselves and how the world sees us. If others tell our stories without us, the truth is lost. So I want to challenge you. Think about the Black history you know and ask yourself why so many of us don't know more about the Black history that has happened right here in Canada. It's not because those stories don't exist. They do. They've been pushed aside, as we've seen. And then ask yourself, where are the Canadian stories connected to the history you already know? Who are the people, places, movements here at home that reflect that same courage, resistance, and creativity? For me, that connection came, and it wasn't until I discovered the Black Writers movement in Montreal that my eyes truly opened. I realized that every part of Black history I learned from the U.S., the fight for justice, the demand for recognition, the pride in identity, had a Canadian counterpart. Real people, right here in our cities, telling those stories. The moment changed everything because Black history in Canada is not an afterthought. It's part of our shared story, part of who we are, and part of the stories we deserve to tell ourselves and tell the world. I want to go back to something that I mentioned earlier, and that was the Black Writers movement that emerged in the late 1960s and 70s in Montreal. And this was a vibrant cultural and political movement, and it brought together a group of Black Canadian writers, poets, intellects who were determined to tell our own stories. Stories that challenged the dominant narrative and spoke truth to power. Now, some key figures like Daphne Marlette, Marlon Hall, Austin Clarke, but my personal favorite, George Elliott Clarke. To me, Clarke stands out because he passionately highlights the value of Black Canadian life. He gave voice to stories that have been long ignored or erased. And it was through his poetry that he celebrated the richness and the complexity and the resilience of Black Canadian identity. My personal favorite poem is Execution Poems, where he says we are unwritten stories, the lives buried beneath the soil, the voices drowned in silence, but still we rise, we speak. It was out of this movement that poems like Execution Poems came out, and a wave of Black radical thought and activism in Canada influenced others like Vernon Foster, a Black Canadian activist and scholar who challenged systemic racism and fought for Black liberation during this era. These ideas inspired writers and activists to reject dominant narratives and to tell their own truth and power with conviction. And why did it matter? Because until then, Black voices were almost invisible in Canadian literature. The movement created a space for Black Canadians to express themselves authentically and reclaim their history and challenge the erasure that they faced. And it wasn't just about art, it was about the activism that it brought. The Black Writers movement helped lay the groundwork for future generations of Black Canadian artists and activists, ensuring that Black stories would no longer be told about us, but by us. And for me, discovering this movement was a revelation. It showed me that Black Canadian history and culture is alive, powerful, and it's deeply rooted in this country's history.
So let's bring this into the present. Because while chains may have been broken, the pen of the narrator hasn't changed hands nearly enough. So in 2025, the control of Black narratives is alive and well, just in different packaging. And if we're honest, it's sometimes even more insidious. Think of how Hollywood frames Black stories: slavery films, police brutality, trauma-centered narratives, produced, directed, and written largely by non-Black creators. The pain is often hypervisible. The complexity, not so much. We've seen this with the green lighting of films like The Help or 12 Years a Slave, where white saviors or whiteness become central vehicles of empathy, right? We even see that in Black Panther, where this white FBI or CIA agent was at the center of the story and helping fight against the evils at hand. So who gets funding? Who gets to be human? Now, let's talk about policy. In 2023, 2024, under Republican-led legislature, and during the Trump-influenced culture war climate, more than 36 states introduced or passed laws limiting the teaching of race, gender, and history under the banner of banning critical race theory. And we have that now with the elimination of DEI and the dismantling of the Department of Education on the federal level in 2025. So Florida's Stop Woke Act, signed by Ron DeSantis, Governor Ron DeSantis, I guess, made it illegal to teach that systemic racism exists if it makes white students feel discomfort. And that we should push these narratives that Black folk and Africans and enslaved individuals benefited from slavery. This false narrative kind of centering and shifting the trauma and the insidious sentiments and experiences of slavery. So Texas revised their curriculum to minimize slavery as a cause of the Civil War. In some school districts, books like the 1619 Project, Beloved, or even the Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, all of those have been banned. That is state-sponsored narrative control. This is not just historical omission. It's a deliberate attempt to reclaim the pen, to define what Blackness means to white audiences. It is narrative colonization under the guise of objectivity. So even under the Trump administration, we saw a sharp narrative distinction. African and Caribbean immigrants were disproportionately excluded from asylum and refugee programs. If you didn't hear about that, check out our last 2 episodes. So all of that's happening while white South Africans were framed as victims of what we think of reverse racism and fast-tracked through a special visa consideration. That policy reflected a narrative. Blackness equals danger. Whiteness equals persecution. And now, in 2025, the echoes persist. Who gets to be seen as a victim? Who gets a microphone after they die? Why does a Black boy need to be perfect, smiling, and college bound to be mourned on a national level? Narrative control isn't just a question of media or education. It determines who is worthy of justice. So, what do we do with this history, this ongoing manipulation? We reclaim the pen. We teach our children the truth, even if the curriculum won't. We publish, we film, we podcast, we amplify, and we call out every system that tries to tell our stories without us. As Toni Morrison said, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. But I'd add, it also keeps you from telling your story. And we're done letting them write our obituary while we're still alive. So we at the Visionaries Vault, Christian and I kind of want to center that narrative, and that's what we want to do with our platform. And that's what we're going to continue to do.
As we wrap today, Khan, I want to leave you with this powerful truth. The stories we tell about ourselves, our communities, our history, they hold the power to shape not only our identity, but the future we're building together. For far too long, Black Canadian voices have been silenced. Our contributions have been minimized. Our struggles have been overlooked. And our triumphs have been buried. But the movements, like the Black Writers' movements, and voices like George Elliott Clarke, have shown us the strength in reclaiming narratives. They remind us that our lives, our words, and our truths are not just worthy of being heard. They're essential to the fabric of this country. Even in 2025, the echoes of erasure and exclusion remain loud, especially in our schools and the public institutes. In Canada, Black folks make up about 3.5% of the national population, yet Black students consistently face disproportionate barriers in education, from being excluded from curricula to facing harsher discipline than their peers. The reality for many Black youth and racialized youth is that when they walk into classrooms every day where their stories are missing, their realities are misunderstood, and their dreams are questioned, this invisibility doesn't just harm their education. It chips away at their sense of identity, belonging, and possibility. And beyond the classroom, we hear louder calls to close borders and restrict immigration, rhetoric that disproportionately impacts Black and racialized communities, and echoes the same exclusionary thinking that has always tried to silence us. But here's this thing. We're still here, we're still creating, and we're still telling our stories on our terms. So I challenge you, whose stories have shaped your understanding of Black life in Canada? Whose voices are missing from your bookshelf, your classrooms, your news feeds? And what will you do to change that? Telling our stories is not just about history. It's about justice. It's about creating a world where everyone sees every child that walks into a room and sees themselves reflected, respected, and affirmed. So thank you for walking with me today. Keep seeking truth. Keep amplifying Black voices. And wherever you are, remember, your story matters. Until next time.
Thank you for tuning in. Our stories have always mattered, even when others tried to silence them. So reclaiming them isn't just about the past. It's about power right now. And as a reminder, this is the Visionaries Vault, a bi-weekly podcast. So we'll be back on August 9th. So hope that you tune in then. And until then, stay grounded, stay bold, and as always, keep the conversation going.